Morning has broken like the first morning. Before I get into responding to ContraPoints, I suppose I should give my own take on the phenomenon of autogynephilia. First of all, I want to stress that I don't believe that trans identity and autogynephilia are the exact same thing, which seems to be what a lot of people imply when they use the terms pretty much interchangeably. I don't think there is a coherent, never mind consistent conception of trans identity at all, so I couldn't honestly say that I think every single trans-identified male is an autogynephile. I'm not saying this to be too complimentary. I think there are other cynical reasons why somebody might identify as trans, but they're just not autogynephilia. However, it is obvious that autogynephilia exists, and it does account for a large proportion of biological males who identify as trans. Why am I so confident in saying that? Because that conclusion is based on two premises that I really don't think anyone could dispute. Firstly, there definitely exists a fetish amongst some biological males around being treated like a woman. These are biological males who get off on the idea of being feminized and emasculated. Often this is conceived of as being something that's done forcefully, and you'll get the term forced feminization. Another term people use is sissy, like a sissy fetish. And this is, I think, pretty obviously autogynephilia. Surely that's what autogynephilia is, right? And the second premise is that given that we know that autogynephilia does exist, because clearly we all know that the fetish I just described exists, and we also know that there are biological males who identify themselves as women, who present in a very feminine way, even getting surgery to that effect, it would be utterly absurd to suggest that these two things have nothing to do with each other. To say that there are biological males who get off sexually on the idea of being treated like women, and there are biological males who identify themselves as women and present in this feminine way and want people to refer to them as women, and somehow these two groups have nothing to do with each other. There's no overlap. There's no autogynephilic male who has this fetish who's then said, hey, maybe I should actually do this thing, which lots of people seem to be doing right now, of identifying myself as a woman in keeping with my fetishistic desire. And by the way, significantly, even ContraPoints concedes that autogynephilia clearly exists.
There definitely are men who get turned on by wearing women's clothes or thinking about having a female body.
This is admitted quite late into the video, I suspect to bury the lead a bit on this quite telling concession. But nonetheless, in having made this admission, Contra would then have to be opposing the second premise, that even though we know there are biological males who have this fetish and there are biological males who identify as women, these two things basically have nothing to do with each other. To this, Contra can only declare that asserting this connection is more complicated.
But the question of whether genuinely autogynephilic trans women exist is more complicated.
But I don't really see how this is complicated, and Contra, of course, offers no substantiation on the complexity. To me, it seems pretty simple. We have men who, via their overt displays of sexualized femininity, are communicating as loudly and as clearly as they can that they are willing to scour the depths of 4chan to find whatever hypno-gifs they can to reinforce this hypersexualized, reductive, sexist notion of womanhood. They are telling us this in no uncertain terms, and yet when some biological males start saying, hey, I actually am a woman, and they maybe even continue that hypersexualized display of womanhood to accompany that, we're supposed to believe this is just a coincidence? This is made even less credible by the fact that demographically there appears to be a quite strong overlap between the types of guys who will view autogynephilic sexual content on places like 4chan and the biological males who post on Twitter behind their anime profiles about their sincerely held trans identity. In fact, I don't think there's much of a meaningful distinction between these two groups at all. So for somebody to convince me that autogynephilia doesn't explain a significant amount of why biological males are coming to identify as trans, they would have to convince me that somehow these two types of beliefs held to by two very similar demographics don't have anything to do with each other. All Contra can manage is a concession that, well, there's always one.
Are there some genuinely autogynephilic transsexuals? Well, at first glance, the answer is yes. I mean, there's always one, isn't there?
I suspect this is intended to lampshade how ridiculous it would be to claim that autogynephilia has nothing to do with trans identity. Nonetheless, it seems pretty obvious to me that conceding that there's just one or only a few autogynephiles in the trans community isn't reflecting the pretty the apparent reality of the situation. By the end of the video, Contra is just forced to resort to frustratedly exclaiming, well, maybe there's any number of potential explanations for any given phenomenon.
But maybe lots of things. Maybe the elder gods ripped my primordial duality in twain, and now I'm yearning for my female half.
This again gives the false impression that autogynephilia as an explanation for trans identity is just some wild speculation, rather than a pretty intuitive conclusion based on immediately observable reality. ContraPoints can't actually respond to the gender-critical position on autogynephilia, but is nonetheless trying to act as if this position is so obviously wrong that taking it seriously is tantamount to accepting some totally ridiculous, spurious claim. It's like a young Earth creationist saying, well, yeah, sure, maybe all organisms on Earth share one common ancestor from which they evolved through a process of natural selection, but maybe anything. Maybe Steve Buscemi is a Martian. Maybe there's an invisible pink unicorn in my garage. You can see the issue. It's associating this well-reasoned theory with these totally nonsense claims as if to imply simply by these two things being associated in the same sentence, they're equally lacking in credibility. I don't think that Contra has any actual arguments against autogynephilia. And by the way, just going forward in this video, I'm going to be using the term autogynephilia as a shorthand for autogynephilia as a significant explanation for why biological males are identifying as trans, because the concept of autogynephilia in itself, Contra doesn't even seem to be trying to deny exists. However, Contra does have a few key objections to this idea that autogynephilia explains trans identity. So first of all, let's talk about the testimony of trans-identified males. If you walk up to a so-called trans woman and say, hey, is your identity as a woman just based in a fetish? Chances are they're going to say, no, it's not. And this is very convincing evidence against autogynephilia because people never lie. I'm being sarcastic, of course, but apparently, according to Contra, to even speculate that people might be lying about this is just unconscionable.
And I'm not going to say that these people are lying about their experiences because that would be a terrible thing to do.
I don't really have much time for Contra's efforts to moralize around this issue. Like, if someone tells me that it offends them when I call them a liar, I don't know, who cares? But Contra, to be fair, does have an intellectual criticism of calling trans-identified males liars, which is that by calling them liars for saying something that would go against your position, you are rendering your position unfalsifiable, and that's not very good epistemologically.
Namely, that trans women who disagree with him are liars. I mean, that's really the scientific ideal, isn't it? A theory that can't be falsified.
So this is honestly such a nonsense statement that I barely even have any patience for it. If contending that opposing testimony is dishonest makes your position unfalsifiable, then that means that the prosecution in any court case where the defendant pleads not guilty would be unfalsifiable. The reality is that this just speaks to Contra's lack of epistemological imagination. Autogynephilia would still be falsifiable even if you discount the testimony of those trans-identified males who claim not to be autogynephilic, because you could appeal to wider observations we can make about society and show how those don't really line up with the theory that lots of trans people are autogynephiles. Contra is dismissive of the idea that autogynephiles come up with bogus stories about trans identity to satisfy their fetish.
Showing up to gender clinics with bogus stories of how they always knew they were women in order to get genital reassignment surgery to satisfy their paraphilia.
I think the assumption here is that nobody would willingly lie about having a trans identity if they knew that this was just to satisfy a fetish. But, to be fair, nobody's necessarily claiming that every single autogynephilic trans-identified male is willingly lying. It could be the case that they're just incredibly self-deluded. Contra seems to be working on the assumption that there is a meaningful difference between fake trans identity that emerges from cynical or sinister motivations, and real, authentic trans identity that is a sincere reflection of somebody's true self. But of course, from a gender-critical perspective, that latter type of trans identity doesn't actually exist, and as such, there is no difference. We're not claiming that autogynephiles are disingenuously co-opting the idea of trans identity for nefarious ends. Rather, we're claiming that trans identity is being used by these people in a manner consistent with what it fundamentally is. On the subject of self-testimony, a large part of this video is focused on the question of whether Contra is autogynephilic.
But I'm not like, oh yeah, I have tits now, that's so hot. I mean, it's kind of hot.
For the record, I don't care if Contra specifically is an autogynephile. I think it's kind of dumb that this video ends by saying, hey, I really didn't want this video to be about me.
Don't have this conversation with someone who started transitioning 5 months ago.
But you made it about you. Contra could have spoken about the idea of autogynephilia as it relates to trans identity in abstract, and there was no need to make this video at times uncomfortably autobiographical. Contra appears indignant about apparently having to expose huge amounts of personal sexual information.
It's humiliating, it's exhausting, and it's required me to publicize a detailed analysis of my most private sexual feelings for the scrutiny of people who despise me.
But again, nobody asked for that. Seemingly, the reason why Contra chose, and yes, this was a choice, to expose all this information is so it could then be argued.
If I had autogynephilic feelings, I would just tell you. I've already admitted to things in this video that I wouldn't tell my own diary on my deathbed.
Basically, if Contra has admitted to a whole load of embarrassing stuff, then why wouldn't Contra just admit to being an autogynephile? Surely this proves that Contra must be honest in claiming not to be. But Contra already gives us the response to this in this very video, because in this video, we hear Contra say that to admit you are an autogynephile would be to admit you are not a woman.
So a lot of trans women, I guess including me, have the idea that you can't be both a woman and an autogynephile.
Contra might well admit to a whole slew of other deeply held secrets, but it's not surprising to me that the last thing Contra would admit is not actually being a woman. But let's just briefly react to Contra's counters to the accusation of autogynephilia. Firstly, Contra says that dressing up in fetishistic bondage gear does not indicate having some kind of obsessive fetishistic personality, because this was only done at the Rocky Horror Picture Show where there was an excuse to do so.
I know Rocky Horror is problematic, but when you're living as a man, there aren't a lot of socially acceptable occasions to try out cross-dressing.
Personally, I think that waiting until there's an excuse to display a fetish doesn't mean it's not a fetish. Contra has some weird ideas about fetishes in general, actually, including saying that something can't be a fetish, or at least implying it can't be a fetish, if it isn't humiliating.
The fetish aspect wasn't really what I liked about it. It wasn't humiliating for me to be feminized.
Honestly, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not qualified and I don't have time for it. On a related note, Contra is very offended by the sexuality of trans people being pathologized.
It seems what's going on here is a lot of pathologizing of normal female sexuality when it exists in trans women.
Before, within the space of less than half a minute, likening sexuality to demonic possession.
I don't think I realized the extent to which my own sexuality felt like a demonic possession or alien infection.
Again, I don't really know how to react to a statement that amounts to stop pathologizing my sexuality that I can only conceive of as being like demonic possession. To be fair, I'm not exactly saying that Contra is wrong about the demonic possession point, because apparently Contra's pre-transition sexuality involved needing to orgasm on a daily basis.
I needed to have an orgasm like every day.
Now again, if you're trying to avoid people pathologizing your sexuality, you may want to avoid saying things like that you had a need to ejaculate every single day until you basically castrated yourself through hormones. And regarding Contra's post-transition sexuality, it's a very male conception of female sexuality, including apparently being more inclined towards bisexuality.
I'm at around a 70-30 attraction to women versus men.
That right there is an undeniably porn-brained notion of what female sexuality is like. And all of this adds some not insubstantial layers of irony when Contra says elsewhere in this video that men will often project their own sexual narcissism onto women.
The notion of the vanity of woman is a misogynistic trope that originates in male projection.
Obviously, this is what Contra is doing. Firstly, in literally claiming that what is in fact a man's sexuality is a woman's sexuality. But secondly, by trying to argue that there is nothing unique about autogynephilia because all women are attracted to the idea of themselves as women.
That women touching their own breasts during sex or while masturbating is not at all uncommon. Is that anatomical autogynephilia?
Contra appears to argue that autogynephiles are in fact victims of misogyny because they are being attacked for their own overt displays of sexuality in the way that women historically have been.
It is the assumption that women enjoy looking at themselves in the same way that men enjoy looking at them, and are hence complicit in their own objectification. I think the concept of the autogynephilic transsexual woman is a combination of this trope with a homophobic trope.
But if it's women who are the ones objecting to autogynephilia, then isn't saying, yeah, but you love to do it too, pretty much exactly what Contra is describing here. You're literally projecting your own sexuality onto women in order to argue that their sexuality justifies your fetishization of their existence. To be fair, Contra does mention that men will show an apparent sexual enthusiasm for their own bodies as well.
I've noticed that cis men seem to really like their own penises and taking pictures of their penises.
Simply stated, the argument from Contra is, well, isn't everyone a little bit into themselves sexually when you think about it? I could argue the nuances of that point. Does a man taking a picture of his own penis parallel a man getting turned on by sissy hypno fetish porn? I think you could contend that suggestion. However, let's assume that everybody does have a similar sexual enthusiasm for themselves. Contra doesn't appear to understand that we could actually acknowledge that, and yet we could still talk about autogynephilia. Indeed, Contra doesn't seem to actually understand what the feminist criticism of autogynephilia is. See, the criticism isn't just that trans-identified males have a sexual desire for themselves. Maybe all biological males have a sexual desire for themselves. However, in what way would that disprove the central contention that the autogynephilia of trans-identified males specifically is an explanation for their trans identity? The ultimate reason to reject trans identity is that no argument has been given for the claim that trans identity is an accurate statement about reality. However, autogynephilia provides an additional moral criticism on top of that intellectual criticism that this dishonest claim of trans identity is being motivated by a fetish, and the performance of that fetish in society is having an impact on women trying to live their lives in this society. If a group of males start watching autogynephilic pornography, and then they start presenting themselves in a way consistent with the depiction of women you're likely to see in that kind of pornography, and then they start claiming, seemingly based on that they are women, all of the criticisms extending from that just aren't at all relevant to whether or not other non-trans identified biological males might enjoy taking photos of their intimate areas, or women playing with signifiers of their own female biology in a sexual context could indicate that they have a similar sexual enthusiasm for their own bodies as women's bodies. The point is that trans identity is a false belief, and as such, we can't understand the significance of autogynephilia while detaching it from the fact it is a manifestation of a false belief. But Contra does have another objection to this autogynephilia theory, which is that trans identity encompasses every aspect of somebody's life, so therefore it can't possibly be a fetish.
When you decide you're going to live as a woman, you have to do that at the grocery store and on airplanes and at Thanksgiving dinner with your family.
But this claim is totally ridiculous. Plenty of people act out fetishes in public to extreme degrees. This is why there's a whole controversy around kink at Pride. But more importantly, Contra seems to be suggesting that somebody wouldn't act on a sexual desire if it had serious negative implications for the rest of their life. And we know this isn't true because people go to prison for sex crimes. Now, I'm not saying that autogynephilia is equivalent to a sex crime, but the point is the fact that people will literally go to prison, which is going to have a massive impact on their lives because of something that they want sexually, that makes it pretty obvious that fetishism can motivate people to do some pretty extreme things. Now, Contra's other related argument involves admitting, okay, maybe some trans-identified people might be initially drawn to trans identity by autogynephilia, but the fetishistic enthusiasm will slowly fade, and yet the trans identity will remain, showing that the trans identity can't ultimately be underpinned by the autogynephilia.
Is that even the rare trans women who identify as autogynephilic admit that after transition, the cross-sex fantasy and arousal vanishes, yet they continue to prefer living as trans women.
This might sound convincing until you consider that all this is really saying is that of course people will eventually get desensitized to sexual gratification. I mean, we all know this. Of course, someone who fully commits to living out their fetish every day of their life is eventually going to find that that fetish doesn't give them a whole load of sexual gratification anymore. But just because that fetish is no longer actively offering them conspicuous sexual gratification doesn't mean that it's in no way underpinning their actions. There's also the sunk cost fallacy. Even if the thing that you were initially enjoying does fade away, now you're committed to what you've done, or you might view yourself as being committed, and as such, you're likely to try and justify the actions you took in retrospect. And on the other side of the spectrum, by the way, there are also lots of other trans-identified males who really haven't committed to the whole trans identity thing in very strong terms at all. A lot of them haven't actually undergone any sort of medical transition or voice training or anything like that, and actually their trans identity consists of nothing more than posting on Twitter with she, her pronouns and a profile picture that's some kind of anime girl. For these people, it could easily be a fetish that exists in the background and doesn't impact their own lives massively at all, and yet, according to official trans dogma, they would be bona fide women, because they claim to be so. All this talk about how the fetishism thing could just fade into the background is likened to being a stale marriage, which Contra says is a ridiculous analogy.
If that sounds like it doesn't make any goddamn sense at all, it's because it doesn't.
But to me, it seems like a pretty good analogy for a very real reality. Contra just relies on taking this analogy incredibly literally.
Are you saying that trans women are a man and a woman inside this? Why do they continue falling in love with other people? I can't even start with this.
Although even then the analogy still functions quite well. While there aren't literally two people, a trans-identified male will have such a massive distinction between the undeniable biological reality and the ideologically constructed trans identity that I really don't think it is unreasonable to talk about the interplay between these two things being like an interpersonal relationship. Contra also makes some criticisms specifically of Ray Blanchard's conception of autogynephilia, mostly consisting of attacking his character, although even then admitting that attacking his character doesn't actually invalidate his ideas.
Even if we could prove that Bailey gets together every weekend with Blanchard to sacrifice a trans baby to Beelzebub, it would still have no bearing on the scientific correctness of the theory.
Despite this, Contra does poison the well early on by highlighting one of Blanchard's collaborators, who it's implied shouldn't be trusted because he made some kind of sexually suggestive comments in some of his work.
Heterosexual man.
Wow, Bailey. Great science writing.
It is kind of massively ironic that Contra objects to how people talking about autogynephilia are attacking other people's sexuality, and yet that's exactly what Contra is doing here by talking about this theorist's sexuality. In terms of debunking these specifics of Blanchard's theory, Contra almost entirely focuses on this idea that there are two easily delineated types of trans-identified male, and Contra rightly points out that this is a simplistic way of categorizing an entire population of people.
Without even leaving my circle of acquaintances, I can think of a trans woman who followed all the cluster A patterns but now dates women, and a trans woman who followed all the cluster B patterns but now exclusively dates men.
But I can't really give Contra any credit for this because I think it's a really obvious point to make. The specific claim that we only have these two groups that can be easily distinguished from each other because what's true of one group isn't true of the other group and vice versa is probably the easiest claim that you could debunk, so unsurprisingly that's what Contra puts almost all of the focus on. Of course, you might notice going after this specific claim doesn't debunk autogynephilia nor do anything to defend the claims of trans identity. Now, I wouldn't really care about this except for that Contra says that the only way to challenge trans identity is via Blanchard's theories.
Trans activists dogmatically adhere to this theory, and that anyone who challenges it will be pursued by a ruthless witch hunt. And of course, the only way to challenge it, we are told, is to defer to Blanchard's typology of homosexual and autogynephilic transsexuals.
I don't know who on earth said this, but it seems to me like it's Contra saying this in order to form a straw man. By introducing the idea that the only way to challenge trans identity is through Blanchard's theories, and then attacking the most easily refutable part of those theories, Contra is giving the impression of having done much more than what in fact has been. In reality, Contra has only poked holes in a small aspect of this notion of autogynephilia that most people probably don't actually care about. One example of misleading framing from Contra is trying to put a focus on the maleness of this theory of autogynephilia.
I just hate that the male sexual perspective is so powerful that it gets to call itself science. It's not that there is no objective truth, it's that this represents a very narrow window on it. identify.
This again fits with Contra's broader attempt to try to act as if the theorizing around autogynephilia is all part of pathologizing women's sexuality. Now, even if this framing was accurate, it wouldn't make autogynephilia illegitimate, but obviously it's also not accurate. Significantly, the last thing I heard about Blanchard is that he went on an episode of The Mess We're In, and he said that he doesn't think autogynephilia is actually that big of an issue, and he got a massive negative response to that from all of the women who care a lot about autogynephilia. Now, for the record, this did happen after Contra had made this video, but it's just one example of how it's completely inaccurate to act as if it is the men who are the bannermen of concern over autogynephilia. And I think Contra must be aware of this, because right at the end of the video, there's a tacit acknowledgement that actually radical feminists are some of the ones who care the most about this problem.
But you know who does love this theory? She's been there literally the whole time.
This is all just framing, but the difference in framing between how Contra's presenting it and the actual reality is pretty stark. Contra would have you believe that this whole thing is about men pathologizing the sexuality of women, but the gender critical position is that this is actually about women objecting to their womanhood being reduced to something sexual by fetishistic men. On that note, I said that Blanchard argues that autogynephilia is essentially harmless, and of course Contra agrees.
And as paraphilias go, this is very harmless.
I'm a biological male. Blanchard is a biological male. ContraPoints is a biological male. My position is it's not really the place of biological males to be talking about how women should feel about their womanhood being reduced to a sexual fetish. There is a power dynamic here and a history of oppression. Men have conceptualized femininity in all sorts of negative and harmful ways in the past. And the insult to the injury of these autogynephilic performances is that these are being done in public in front of women, and social pressure is being used to tell these women that they shouldn't care about it, and even state mandate is being used to force women to play along with this. When you think about it in those terms, this supposedly harmless thing becomes a lot more perverse. And I would recommend that anybody watching this right now actually look at what women have said on this topic, because there's really not much point me telling you in detail why it's harmful. There are women who are the ones who are actually being harmed who can tell you that already. Anyway, so let's begin to finish this video by looking at some of the broader points that Contra makes about trans identity. Because, to clarify a point, whether trans identity is based on autogynephilia is not the most important issue here. The most important question is, does trans identity make sense? When a biological male claims to be a woman, should you believe that is true? Now, of course, this wasn't the focus of Contra's video, so it's not a bad thing that there's not too much to say here, but I just thought it was worth addressing what Contra does say in this regard. Firstly, Contra claims that conceiving of trans identity as being a woman in a man's body or having some kind of feminine soul is only a way that trans identity should be spoken about for the benefit of less analytically minded people.
Sometimes you have to explain what it means to be trans to a person who believes that dogs go to heaven.
In fact, Contra almost seems to suggest that the only reason why almost every single trans person talks about their trans identity as if it's little more than spurious postmodern New Age mysticism is because they are talking down to the less analytically minded people who might not be convinced of trans identity. And then Contra suggests that this way of talking about trans identity gives an inaccurate impression to the more analytically minded people like me.
But the useful platitudes become a problem when more analytically minded people start putting these things under the microscope, and then they end up concluding that trans people are just fetishists who are telling lies about themselves.
Now, this is fine in theory, but what do I put under the microscope? What have I done exhaustive reactions to? Scripted videos by professional YouTubers who have made it their entire life's goal to talk about this stuff. I've reacted to interviews by the most prominent queer theorist, Judith Butler. I've read academic books about this issue. I've read academic studies about this issue. I got a really, really high grade. I'm not going to brag too much, but I got a really, really high grade for a literature review that I did for my master's level at university, and it was on this subject of trans identity. And by the way, if you appreciate all the work I've done to build my knowledge base for this channel and would be interested in me having the ability to spend more time building that knowledge base in the future, then you can give on Patreon. And if you do give on Patreon, that's incredibly appreciated. So I will now thank thank those who do that. You're all very appreciated. The question then is, why am I still missing this analytically minded argument, Contra? Why is it that I've looked everywhere, from the most plebeian, just person on the street giving their hot take off the cuff, to peer-reviewed scholarly articles, and nowhere have I found any even like slightly different or varied argument for trans identity, and nothing more intellectual and analytically minded. Oh, screw it. You know what? I can't be bothered. I'm not gonna retake that. That was the last word. I'm just gonna keep that in. This happens so often. You have no idea how many times I screw up literally the very last word. I say the whole thing, and then I'll get to the end of it. I'm mystified as to how anyone could honestly claim that there is a more persuasive conception of trans identity out there that is different from the regular standard line that most people are used to hearing. But I guess that's the key word, right? Honestly. The people who are saying this, they aren't actually being honest. They're just pretending that there is some better argument out there when there isn't. Contra claims that Blanchard's arguments are motivated by the presupposition that so-called trans women are more like men than they are like women.
Is he takes as foundational the presupposition that trans women are psychologically more like cis men than cis women.
Contra, that isn't a presupposition, that's a conclusion. You can't just pretend conclusions are presuppositions as a way to dismiss them. The idea that trans-identified males are more like men than women is first of all based in the observation that no argument has been given for the fact that trans identity changes a man to being a woman, and as such trans-identified males are very much like men in that they literally are men. But also, the behavior of the trans community can very easily be observed. We can see them. I mean, we have the whole Trans Day of Visibility thing, right? They're not hiding who they are, and most people can easily recognize that so-called trans women in many ways behave a lot more like men than they do like women. Just because there might be a very short period of time between an honest person meeting a trans-identified male and then concluding that biological male is way more like a man than a woman, doesn't mean it was a presupposition going into it. It could have just been that was something that was very immediately obvious for them to observe. There are a few things Contra let slip about the trans ideology movement in this video. First of all, saying that the trans community is very reluctant to give any exposure to claims that disagree with them.
But a lot of trans women are probably nervously wondering why I'm using my platform to potentially increase awareness of a sinister fringe theory that only adds to the stigma we all already face.
This is an issue and something that people definitely should be made aware of. One side is perfectly willing to discuss all the arguments being brought to the table, while the other side, the trans ideologue side, is all about trying to shut down debate as much as possible. Almost as if they recognise that the gender critical arguments are very convincing, and that's why they want to keep people from hearing about them. What's more concerning is that Contra doesn't respond to this by saying, hey, actually guys, it's important that we hear what different sides have to say, so we can make sure that our positions are correct by listening to all the different arguments. No, instead, Contra says that it's now time to talk about this issue only because the damage is already done.
I've had several conversations with academics and journalists where it becomes clear that they believe in Blanchard's theory, even if the cowards won't admit it to my face. So, as I see it, the damage is already done. What's needed now is an accessible, convincing refutation of the theory.
So there you go. Contra is admitting that it would be ideal if you never heard any arguments from the opposing point of view, but that because now people are aware of this argument, there does need to be some response to it. Trans activists will engage with opposing points of view as little as they can get away with. That much is obvious. What's quite interesting is I don't even actually agree with Contra's initial premise that most people are aware of autogynephilia. Most people don't, and I suspect if more people did, then a lot fewer people would take trans identity seriously. Anyway, one final point is that Contra claims that so-called trans women are called narcissists simply for expressing their opinion.
And hence, any trans woman who raises her voice in this conversation is accused of exhibiting narcissistic rage.
That's of course not true. If trans-identified males are called narcissists, it's probably because of all the narcissistic things they do, and not for any less legitimate reason. Anyway everyone, that's the end of the video. I'll say all the standard things that of course if you go on Patreon, like, comment, share, subscribe, all the algorithm stuff. You guys are very good at that, I appreciate it. I suppose actually one thing I'll say just before I show you the Patreon clip is this was kind of a bit of an exciting video because so again, this is like a bit of deep KC lore, which I have explained several times, but I wouldn't expect everyone to know about, especially with all the new subscribers. 25,000, way! Anyway, I'm just trying to think, well, okay, yeah, so this will be going up reasonably soon after the 25k actually. But Yes. So a while ago, I experimented with just having this channel be for live streams and then having a different channel for scripted content. Interestingly, this was only like a few weeks before YouTube introduced the new system where they put live streams and videos under different sections of the channel. So at the time, the live streams and the scripted videos were just on top of each other, and it was very difficult for people to tell the difference. So I thought, I'll create a channel separately for the scripted content so people who don't like the rambly nature of the live streams can go to the other channel and they can just get access to the scripted content. Of course, later on, like I say, they introduced a new system where you have the live streams in one section, the videos in another, which meant that I was able to now just start making, and then obviously I kind of fell out of love with doing the live streams. Although, tangent within a tangent, I am doing religion live streams. If you like the idea of live streams, if you like the idea of being able to interact with me and I will see what you'll say and I can respond to it directly, and also you're interested, maybe in my opinion, on religion. If you don't know, I am a Christian. That is usually very shocking to a lot of people. I think I have good reasons to be a Christian. Unfortunately, if you're going to, so I will say, if you come to a live stream and you comment, I might not be able to respond to every single critical comment because a lot of comments might be very big, it might totally distract from the video. But if you hang around, then, eventually one of your comments will get through. So you should go over to the live stream channel. There we go. Tangent within a tangent over. So basically what I realized is I should move all of my scripted content to here. But I thought, well, I feel like I'm better at making videos now and delivering videos, despite the fact that, how about this? So I'm not crazy. Like just then, the camera was like super blurry, right? I actually have no idea why this happens. I need to get a proper DSLR or something. Like I need to learn how cameras work. I also don't quite like that this is like coming in front of my head, whatever. Yeah. Patreon. That's, I need like some kind of thing where I just say, at some point, I'm going to get proper like equipment to actually make the videos look as good as they can. Obviously for me, the appearance of the videos isn't the top thing, but it does annoy me whenever, because I see it too, when randomly the camera goes out of focus and blurs, and I don't know how that works. I'm not like an expert. I'm not an expert on cameras in general, and I also feel like this camera is probably not the best camera in the world. Tangent again. Anyway, the point is that I realized that I was better at making videos on now. So I was like, well, what I should do is I should basically just recreate those videos based on my original scripts. So I got the original scripts, recreated the video, boom, here I am. The point is, and I guess you can maybe tell where this is going, this is the last video. So this is there was only one more video left on that channel that I hadn't migrated over here, and I'm doing that now. So that is the significance. I feel like it was way too long of a journey to get there. To me, it's significant. You guys probably don't care. And I've now probably screwed myself over, because what I could now do is say, hey everyone, here's a clip to my Patreon and you get access to a bonus Patreon video. And doesn't this look incredibly entertaining? The problem is that most of the people who might have needed to be suckered in by a nice clip showing all of this content they could be watching have probably left by now, so that's not great. But for those of you who are still here and you're thinking, hey, I want to see even more rambling, well, here's a bonus clip from my Patreon.
I always liked math and science. That's not traditionally a girl thing.
Oh God, this is insane. To be like, oh man, I'm really worried that the transphobes are going to take away my rights because I'm a girl who likes maths and science. And obviously, if you think a biological male can't be a woman, well, I don't know. There's lots of women who like maths and science, so maybe they're not women either. Brilliant.
I was always adventurous and very loud and unapologetic about my opinions. And these are all...
You should be apologizing about your opinions, because your opinions are very bad.
Not girl things. These are boy things. And thinking about all of this for a while, I came upon the answer. I had a hormone imbalance.
Is this... Okay, I need to see where this is going. Because... What? So yeah, what I do there is I just take in nominations from people. People get to vote on what they respond to. The point of that is that, for content which isn't so important, obviously, like ContraPoints and things like that, that's like big stuff, which I would do on here. But then there's also lots of other small potatoes, I guess is the expression, and I respond to them on my Patreon. So that's the end of this video. apologies for, I don't know, stumbling over the finish line. I was like, I'll just say like a little quick tidbit about how interesting it is that this is the final video that I've had to migrate over from my, once exclusively scripted content channel. And I didn't even say the other thing, which I should say, because this is very important. That scripted channel is now a vlog channel, where I'm actually planning on revitalizing that, because I've been thinking it through and I've been like, you know what, actually, I think that's something that would be worth doing. I think there's, with my limited amount of resources, I think that would be quite a good use of them. So you should go over to that channel and subscribe to it now, because there are 2 videos there already. They're both very entertaining videos. You would enjoy them, I can guarantee that. But yeah, there will be even more videos there soon. I'm just kind of getting into a position where I feel like I can actually commit to starting a new channel. Bye! Praise with elation, praise every morning, God's recreation of the new day.